The dust hadn't settled when he saw her, small still, and alone at the edge of the road where no one ever stopped twice. His horse slowed before he told it to, instinct tightening through his chest like something long buried had just been pulled loose. The girl didn't cry, didn't reach, just stood there with hollow eyes too old for her size, bare feet pressed into the dirt. When he stepped down, she looked up at him and said it plain, like she'd already learned not to expect more. Mama said not to wait for her. He didn't answer right away, because turning back would be easier, cleaner, but staying meant becoming the kind of man he hadn't been in years. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. The wind dragged a thin line of dust across the road between them, but she didn't move from her spot. Not a step forward, not a step back. Just stood there like she'd been placed and forgotten, small shoulders squared against a world too wide for her. He kept his hand on the reins, though the horse had already settled. The animal sensed it too, the wrongness of it. A child alone out here didn't belong to chance. It belonged to something colder. He looked past her first. The road stretched empty in both directions, sun-baked and quiet. No wagon creak in the distance. No rider cutting the horizon. Just old tracks pressed deep into the dirt, edges softened by time. Nothing fresh enough to matter. Nothing that said someone was coming back. His jaw tightened. When he looked at her again, he didn't rush it. Took in the small things the way a man does when he's trying not to feel what they mean. Dust clung to her cheeks in uneven streaks, like she'd wiped her face with hands too tired to care. Her dress hung loose, hem frayed and stiff, one sleeve torn near the shoulder. Bare feet planted firm, though the ground would have burned most grown men by now. Still no tears. That was what stayed with him. Most children would cry, reach, call out for someone, but she didn't do any of that. Just watched him with those steady, hollow eyes, like she was waiting for something she didn't expect to come. He swung his leg over and stepped down slow, boots pressing into the dirt with a weight that felt heavier than usual. The distance between them wasn't far, but it stretched in a way he couldn't explain. Like crossing it meant something more than just closing space. He stopped a few paces from her. "You got a name?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than intended, like it hadn't been used for something gentle in a long while. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze dipped just for a second, then lifted again. Careful, measuring, like she was deciding if it mattered. "Leela," she said, soft, almost lost in the wind. He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Leela," he repeated, letting it settle. A name made things real, harder to walk away from. He glanced past her again, slower this time, scanning the edges of the road, the scrub brush, the slight dips where a wagon might have turned off. Nothing, not even the suggestion of someone watching from a distance. Whoever left her had meant it. His hand flexed at his side. He looked back down at her. She hadn't moved, not even shifted her weight. Just stood there, waiting in that quiet way that felt older than she was. "I'm gonna take a look up the road," he said after a moment. "See if someone's coming." It wasn't a promise, wasn't even a plan, just something to say. "You stay right here." She nodded, no question, no hesitation. Just a small, simple dip of her head, like she'd been told worse things and learned not to argue. That did something to him, more than if she'd cried. More than if she'd reached for him or begged him not to go. Because this stillness, this acceptance, it meant she already knew how this ended most times. Alone, he turned slightly, taking a step as if to follow through on his own words, but the movement slowed before it found its purpose. Behind him, she didn't call out, didn't ask how long, didn't ask if he'd come back, and that was what stopped him cold. Because a child who didn't ask that question had already been given the answer too many times. He lifted her without asking again, one broad hand steady at her side, the other guiding her small legs over the saddle horn until she sat in front of him, light as a bedroll and twice as unsettling. She didn't resist, didn't cling either, just settled where he placed her, hands resting on the worn leather, as if she had already decided the world would move her wherever it pleased. He clicked his tongue, and the horse turned toward town. dust rose soft behind them. The little girl swayed once with the motion, then leaned back by instinct when the mare took a shallow dip in the road. His arm came around her before he thought to stop it, firm across her middle, keeping her steady. He told himself it was practical. A child that small would slip easy if the horse startled. But when she stayed tucked against him after the ground leveled out, quiet and trusting in that strange, absent way, his grip did not loosen. Town came into view slowly, false front buildings, hitching rails, heat wavering over the main road, the afternoon wearing on with the dry patience of a place that believed it had seen every kind of trouble already. Men near the feed store looked up first, then women by the mercantile porch, then the idle pair outside the barber. Eyes followed him with the same dull curiosity they might have given a stray calf brought in from the scrub, until they noticed what he carried. The silence shifted, not much, just enough. He felt it ripple before anyone spoke. "Cord," someone called. He didn't answer. Boots scuffed on the boardwalk. A chair creaked outside the hotel. The little girl lowered her eyes at the sound of voices, but she didn't tense. That struck him harder than it should have. A child ought to flinch when strangers stared, ought to look for a place to hide. She had the stillness of someone who had already learned that hiding and being seen often ended the same. He guided the mare to the trough and reined in. For a moment he sat there, one hand on the horn, the other still braced around her, as if getting down would make the whole matter official in a way turning into town had not. "Whose child is that?" A woman asked from the shade of the mercantile. He recognized her voice before the face, Mrs. Pritchard, who measured worth the way she measured flour, by weight and waste. "Don't know," he said. "Found her out on the road." That drew more eyes. A man near the livery gave a low whistle. "Alone, looks that way." He swung down first, then reached up for the girl. She came easily, warm from the sun and small enough that lifting her made his chest tighten for reasons he refused to name. Once her feet touched dirt, she stayed close to his leg without being told. Not clinging, not quite, just near enough that the hem of her dress brushed his boot. "You ought to take her to the church," Mrs. Pritchard said, stepping closer now that pity could be performed in public. "Reverend Bell's wife will know what to do." Another voice cut in from the trough. "Or the county office, if you can stomach the wait." "Orphan trains due through in a few weeks," somebody added from the porch like he was remarking on rain. "They collect children all the time." The words hung there, clean and practical and empty. He looked down at the girl. She had gone stiller somehow, if that were possible. No tears, no confusion, just that same hollow patience, as if adults discussing where to put her was no surprise at all. Something inside him turned hard. Reverend Bell himself came out from the side lane with his hat in hand, his kind face lined deeper than last winter. He stopped when he saw them and took in the scene quicker than most. "Elias," he said. "What happened?" He hated when men used his name soft. It made room for things he had no use for. "Found her outside town. Any sign of family?" "No." The Reverend crouched some distance away, careful not to crowd her. "Hello there, little one." She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked to him and back down. Bell rose slowly. "My wife can keep her until we sort things out." Until we sort things out. He should have welcomed that, should have felt relieved. He had cattle to tend, fencing half done along the south line, a life built exact and narrow so it wouldn't leave room for the kinds of ache that once hollowed a man from the inside. A child did not fit in that life. A nameless obligation fit even less. Yet when he pictured placing her in Bell's care and riding away while she sat in some church room with folded hands and that same emptied-out face, his mouth set into a grim line. He looked down at her again. "What's your mamma's name?" He asked. It came out blunt. He softened nothing. The girl's fingers curled into the side seam of her dress. "Mama, does she got another name?" A small shake of the head. "Where'd she leave you?" She glanced toward the road they had come from, then lowered her eyes. Said, "Wait." One of the women on the porch let out a breath like a prayer gone sour. He forced himself to keep his voice even. "How long did you wait?" The child thought about it, not because she didn't understand. Because time meant little to someone her size. "Sun was high," she said at last. He looked west. The light had already begun to bend. Bell's wife would offer broth. Mrs. Pritchard would fuss. Someone would mention paperwork. Someone else would remind him that none of it was his burden. All of them would be right. That was the trouble. "Come along now," Mrs. Pritchard said, holding out a hand toward the girl with the bland certainty of a woman moving someone else's dishes. "We'll get you clean and settled." The little girl looked at the hand. Then, without drama, without so much as a sound, she shifted one half step until her shoulder touched his leg. That was all. No plea, no reaching, just a choice made as quietly as breathing. His hand came down to rest against the back of her head before he realized he'd moved it. Belle watched him. The others watched too. "Elias," the Reverend said, careful as a man stepping near a skittish horse, "no one's saying you must decide today." But that was just it. The decision had started the moment he turned his horse toward town instead of away from it. He could feel it now, pressing under the ribs. He looked at the child's dusty hair, the narrow shoulders, the neck too thin above a collar gone soft with wear. Handing her off would be proper, sensible. It would let the matter belong to people who still believed systems could mend what people broke. "I ain't taking her to the county," he said. A few heads turned. "Didn't say you had to," Belle replied. "And she's not going on any orphan train." "Then the church," Mrs. Pritchard insisted, a brittle edge entering her tone. "That's what the church is for." He looked at her, not long, just enough, maybe, but his arm had already circled the little girl again. Belle saw it. Maybe that was why he didn't argue when Elias lifted her back to the saddle. "Just for the night," he said, though no one had asked. The word sounded meant for himself. "I'll ask around tomorrow, see if anyone knows anything." "Elias," Belle stepped closer, voice low, "if this is too much." "It isn't," he said, too quick. Belle's gaze held his for a moment, seeing more than was welcome. Then the Reverend nodded once. "All right, but send word if you need anything." Need. There was a word he'd spent years cutting from his own vocabulary. He mounted behind her and turned the mare toward the north road. As they moved off, the town's murmur rose behind them, low judgments, idle concern, curiosity dressed as charity. He didn't listen. The girl leaned back into him again before they cleared the last building. This time she did not even seem aware she was doing it. The ranch sat a few miles out where the land opened and the silence deepened. He had chosen it for that. After the town and the burying and the endless looks from people who thought grief was a thing you ought to discuss if you wanted it to behave, he had bought distance the way other men bought relief. The house stood square and weathered against the wide sky, porch boards silvering with age, barn off to the side, corrals mended neat, everything in its place, everything with a use. He dismounted slowly when they arrived, then lifted her down. She tipped her face up toward the house with no visible reaction. No wonder. To a child who had stood forgotten beside a road, a house meant little until proven otherwise. "Come on," he said. He kept his tone flat because he had forgotten any other habit. She followed him up the porch steps, her bare feet soundless on the wood. Inside, the air held the faint smells of coffee gone stale, clean pine, and the ash from last night's fire. He set his hat on the peg by the door and noticed, with sudden, unreasonable irritation, how much space a second small presence could take up simply by being there. She stood just inside, hands at her sides, looking without looking. The front room was swept, the tables scrubbed, curtains plain and open to the light, nothing soft except the old braided rug near the hearth. He had removed softness where he could. Softness invited memory. He crossed to the washstand and poured water into a basin. "Hold still." She obeyed. He dampened a cloth and crouched before her. Up close, the dirt on her face gave way in streaks, revealing skin too pale beneath the sun and a bruise yellow shadow near one temple not quite old and not wholly new. His jaw tightened. "This hurt?" he asked, touching no nearer than air. She blinked at him, then gave the smallest shrug, as if hurt was weather. As if it arrived and left without anyone asking why. He cleaned her hands next. Tiny fingers, a scrape across the knuckles, dirt caked in the crescent of each nail. She watched him as though she had never seen a grown man take his time with something that did not belong to him. "Sit." He nodded toward the chair nearest the table. She climbed into it awkwardly, knees barely bending over the edge, and folded her hands in her lap. He turned to the cupboard with more force than necessary. Beans from last night, bread in the tin, a heel of cheese. He set them out, then paused with his hand on a second plate. The cupboard shelf held two, always two. He used one. The other stayed because removing it had felt like admission and leaving it had felt like punishment, and somewhere along the years he had stopped asking which was which. He took both down anyway, then stood staring at them while the room grew quieter around him. Finally, he placed one before her and one at the other end of the table out of old reflex, though he already knew he would not sit there. The girl's eyes went to the extra plate and lingered, not curious. Not prying, simply noticing. That bothered him more than if she had asked. She noticed the wooden horse too, half hidden on the shelf by the window where dust had gathered around it but not on it. He had never thrown it out, had never touched it either, not beyond moving it aside when he cleaned. Her gaze rested there for a heartbeat, then slipped away. Children in healthy homes reached for things. They poked, wandered, tested the boundaries of welcome. She did none of it. She sat where he had placed her, shoulders straight, waiting for permission to exist. He set the bowl before her. Eat. She looked at the food, then at him, then back to the bowl. He busied himself at the stove so he would not have to watch, but the quiet made him turn after only a moment. She had taken a piece of bread in both hands and torn off the smallest bite imaginable. Chewed slowly, swallowed carefully, then another, no grabbing, no stuffing food into her mouth like a starved child in a story men told to feel generous. She ate as though the meal might be taken if she proved too eager for it. Recognition hit him then, not pity, which asked nothing of a man but sadness. Recognition asked more. He had seen that same measured caution once in another small face when fever left no appetite but fear of waste remained. His chest went rigid. He turned back to the stove, one hand braced on the counter until the feeling passed enough to breathe through it. Behind him, the spoon touched the bowl in soft, steady sounds. When he finally sat, it was not at the empty place but on the bench by the wall. He ate standing halfway up, as if ready to move should the room become too crowded with memory. "How old are you?" he asked after a while. She looked up, cheeks hollowing as she swallowed. "3, she said, then frowned like the number might be borrowed. "Maybe." He almost asked who had told her that, but stopped. The answer would likely be no one. "You got another name besides Leela?" "No, a last name." She shook her head. He could have asked more, about her mother, about where she had slept before the road, about the bruise. But there was a limit to what a child that small could give, and some part of him knew answers would only sharpen the thing already cutting at him. After she finished, she placed the spoon in the empty bowl with care and folded her hands again. He stared a moment. "You can ask for more." She lowered her eyes. "Can I?" 2 words, soft as dust. He looked away first. "Yes." She ate a second helping slower than the first. Dusk crept against the windows by the time he cleared the table. She stood when he told her to, then stopped near the hearth while he banked the fire and lit the lamp. The house, always quiet, now felt as if it were listening to itself. He showed her the small room off the kitchen where he kept folded quilts and a narrow cot for the occasional hand during storm season. It was plain, but clean. She stepped inside and turned once, taking it in without touching the blanket, the wash pitcher, the chair in the corner. He saw her eyes drift past the hallway before settling back on him. Down that hallway, one door remained closed. Always, he had not opened it in months, maybe longer. Past it, near the back window, a framed photograph sat face down on the sideboard where he had left it one winter night and never righted again. Outside, beyond the far fence, the grave marker stood beneath the cottonwood, pale in the fading light. His whole life here had been arranged around those absences. Keep the room closed. Keep the picture turned. Keep the grave tended and unnamed in conversation. Keep the heart of the house reduced to stove, table, bed, work. It had held mostly. Until a child with dust on her face and no expectation of rescue crossed his threshold and sat at his table like silence had always been her native tongue. "You can sleep here," he said, "just tonight." The lie came easy because it was smaller than the truth he refused to speak. She nodded and sat on the edge of the cot without climbing under the blanket. He lingered in the doorway longer than he meant to. "Need anything?" She looked at him as if the question itself were unfamiliar. Then she shook her head. He turned away, stepping into the hallway, but some pull made him glance once more toward the shut door at the end. Memory struck in fragments, never whole anymore. Laughter cut off too soon. A fevered hand no bigger than a bird's wing. A woman's voice worn thin by pleading and prayer. Soil thudding against pine. After that had come the hardening, not all at once. Hardening never did. It arrived in choices made to survive the next hour, then the next week, until a man woke one day to find kindness had become a thing he handled only with gloves. Love, even more so, safer that way, cleaner. Distance kept a body upright. Distance let a ranch run on time and order and silence. Yet as he stood there with lamplight at his back and the child waiting in the spare room, the old wound stirred under the scar tissue, not raw but deep enough to remind him it had never truly healed. He heard a small rustle and looked back. She had lain down without pulling the blanket higher, feet tucked in, hands folded over her middle, as if sleep were another thing one entered carefully to avoid trouble. "Leela," he said before he could stop himself. Her eyes opened wider in the half-light. "You're safe here tonight." He almost hated the words once they were out. They sounded like a promise, and promises had cost him more than he had left to lose. But the child only blinked and gave the faintest nod. No smile. No relief dramatic enough to break him. Just acceptance, as if safety for one night was generous enough not to question. He pulled the door nearly shut and stood in the darkened kitchen for a long time after the house settled. The untouched second plate sat drying by the basin. The wooden horse watched from the shelf. Beyond the window, the grave caught the last grey of evening beneath the cottonwood. He had told himself this was temporary, a night, maybe two, long enough to ask questions in town, find a name, hand the burden where it belonged. But the ranch no longer felt like a place waiting to be returned to its usual shape. Something had entered with that little girl besides dust and need, something quieter, more dangerous. A living reminder that the heart he had spent years walling off could still recognize hunger when it saw it, not the kind fed by bread alone. The kind born when a child learned too early that being left behind was ordinary. He rubbed a hand over his face and stared toward the spare room where no sound came at all. That silence frightened him most. Because it told him she was used to sleeping in places where asking for comfort was useless. And because, against all judgment, against every hard lesson grief had carved into him, he already knew one thing with a certainty he did not welcome. If morning came and someone tried to take her somewhere cold and proper and far from him, he was not at all sure he would let them. Morning entered the house carefully, pale and thin through the kitchen window, as if even daylight knew better than to make too much noise there. Elias woke before the sun cleared the far ridge, same as always. For a few seconds he lay still in the half-cold room, listening to the ranch settle around him, the soft creak of boards, the distant nicker from the barn wind moving low through the grass. Then he remembered the small shape in the spare room, and the stillness inside him tightened. He dressed without striking a lamp and stepped into the hallway. The spare room door stood open. His pulse jumped once, hard and sharp, before reason caught up. She had not run, she had not wandered. She was in the kitchen, standing by the front door with both hands at her sides, shoesless still, face washed only where last night's water had reached. The blanket from the cot had been folded, not neatly but with care, and left at the foot of the bed. She had prepared to go, not because he had told her to, not because she was restless, just because morning had come, and somewhere in that small body lived the rule that one did not remain where one had only been tolerated for a night. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment before speaking. "You been up long?" She turned her head, a little. No complaint, no explanation. The light touched her hair in dull strands, and he noticed how small her shoulders looked in the grey of day, smaller than they had in the road. Smaller than they had at the table. Night had given the illusion of shelter, morning stripped it away. "Why are you standing there?" he asked. She looked at the door as if the answer were written in the wood. "Ready." "For what?" A tiny shrug. "To go." He stared at her. There it was again, that quiet acceptance with no edges on it, no tantrum, no bargaining. A child her age should have clung to the thought of breakfast and blankets and one more hour inside. Should have asked in the small, stubborn way children asked for what they wanted without even knowing the cost. But Leela only waited, as though being passed along was as natural as sunup. He crossed the room slowly, feeling something cold and old shift under his ribs. "Where would you go?" Another shrug, softer this time. The question seemed to trouble her, not because she feared the answer, but because it had no shape to give. "Mama said not to wait," she murmured. He had heard the words before on the road, at the table. But this time they landed different, not as a sad thing said by a lost child, As a rule, an instruction so deeply planted it had become the frame around her whole little world. Don't wait, don't expect, don't ask. That truth struck him harder than any crying fit could have. He imagined her mother crouching low enough to be eye level, speaking plain because lies took effort, telling a child no older than 3 not to wait for her, then walking away. A heat rose through him so sudden it made his hands curl. Leela looked up, not frightened exactly, only careful. He unclenched his jaw. "You ain't going anywhere yet," he said. The words came rough, but firm enough to stop the air in the room. She blinked once. "No." "No," he turned toward the stove, because facing her after that felt too much like standing before an open grave. "You're eating first." He heard no reply, only the small sound of her feet moving as she obeyed. When he looked back, she had gone to the chair from last night and climbed into it on her own, folding her hands in her lap again, waiting to be allowed the next thing. He set water to boil, cut bread, fried what remained of the salt pork. Every movement felt louder than usual. The house no longer held silence the way it used to. It held witness. He put a tin cup of milk before her, and a plate with food she hadn't asked for. She touched neither right away. "You can start," he said. She looked up to check whether he meant it. Then she took the cup in both hands and drank carefully, as if spilling would cost her the rest. Something in him gave an inch. By the time the meal was done, the sun had warmed the yard enough to pull work from a man whether he wanted it or not. Fence wire waited. A horse needed shoeing. Feed had to be hauled. He should have saddled up, ridden to town, asked harder questions, found someone willing to claim a child, so he could return to the exact, deliberate life he had built after losing everything worth building around. Instead, he found himself cutting an old shirt down at the sleeves to make something cleaner for her to wear. She watched from the table while he worked the shears. "That for me?" she asked. The fact that she asked at all told him how rare such things had been. "It's not for the horse." A pause, then the faintest thing touched her face, not a smile, more like the memory of one. He cleared his throat and handed her the cloth once it was tight enough to fit. She slipped into it behind the half-open pantry door because some instinct told her privacy was something granted rather than owned. When she stepped back out, the shirt hung long on her, nearly to her calves, sleeves rolled twice. Ridiculous, temporary, better than what she had. He nodded once. "That'll do." She touched the fabric near her shoulder with quiet wonder, then dropped her hand as if she'd done too much. The wind shifted outside. Hoofbeats sounded faint along the road. He stiffened before he knew why. Not many rode out his way uninvited. Fewer still came early. Leela heard it too. Her eyes moved toward the window, then back to him. She didn't ask if someone had come for her, did not show hope. That more than anything, told him she did not believe rescue wore familiar faces. He crossed to the door and stepped onto the porch. A rider approached in a lazy cloud of dust, hat tipped back, shoulders loose, with the kind of confidence men carried when they expected every conversation to end in their favor. It was Wade Harlan from town, owner of too many acres for a man with too little conscience, followed some distance behind by Sheriff Dobbs, whose horse moved slower and whose expression usually arrived before the rest of him. Elias felt his mood darken. Harlan pulled up first, grinning as if they shared some private joke. "Heard you brought home company," he said. Dobbs reined in beside him with less flourish. "Morning, Elias." "What do you want?" Harlan glanced past him toward the doorway. "Just came to see if the story was true." Elias did not move. "Story's none of your business." Harlan chuckled, but his eyes sharpened. "Town says you found a little girl on the road, says you turned down the church. Folks are talking." "Folks always talk." "That they do." Harlan leaned a forearm over the saddle horn. "Question is what they're saying." Sheriff Dobbs removed his hat and wiped his brow with a folded handkerchief. He was a heavy-set man made gentler by age, not weak, just slow to believe the worst until it proved itself. "Mind if we step inside?" Elias should have refused, yet refusing would make this smell worse than it already did. He stepped aside enough for Dobbs alone. Harlan noticed. "Not you," Elias said. The grin thinned. "Touchy." "Go home, Wade." Harlan stayed where he was a beat too long, then shrugged. I'll be around. He rode off slow on purpose, making sure his departure felt like a promise instead of a retreat. Dobbs tied his horse and came up the steps with a weary look that deepened the lines beside his mouth. Inside, he spotted Leela at once and softened. Well now, he said gently, there you are. She did not answer. Her chair scraped once as she shifted closer to Elia's leg. The sheriff saw that too. I'm not here to trouble her, he said, keeping his voice low. Only need to understand the situation. That makes two of us. Dobbs nodded. Town says she was left outside the South Road. Reverend Bell says you found her around midday. Mrs. Pritchard says you refused to hand her over. Harlan says. I don't care what Harlan says. No reason you should, the sheriff sighed, but I do need to ask what your intentions are. Intentions? The word sat between them like something formal and civilized, as if children were parcels and not breathing souls. She stayed the night, Elias said. That's all. Dobbs studied him with an old lawman's patience. And this morning. Elias did not answer right away. The sheriff glanced at Leela, taking in the clean shirt, the washed face, the way the child leaned toward a man not known for inviting dependence. When he looked back, there was no accusation in his eyes, only concern sharpened by experience. You know how this goes, he said. If no family can be found, she'll need placing proper, church for the moment, county after that. Leela lowered her gaze to her hands. Elias heard the sentence as if it had been spoken over a coffin. Proper, he repeated, the word turning bitter in his mouth. Dobbs folded his hat between both hands. I didn't make the rules. No, but you'll enforce them. If it comes to that. Outside, a gust moved the porch swing chain with a dry metallic click. Inside, the silence deepened. Dobbs cleared his throat. There's another matter. Elias waited. Men like Harlan notice things. A young child with no one to speak for her attracts all kinds. Some want the county reward if kin can't be found. Some want labor down the line. Some, his jaw worked once. Some don't want any trouble attached to finding a child where questions might laid. Elias' gaze hardened. Say it plain. Dobbs met his eyes. If someone abandoned her on purpose, there's a chance somebody comes looking, not to save her, to close loose ends. The kitchen seemed to shrink around those words. Leela sat very still, too young to catch the full meaning, but old enough to feel the shift in adults when danger entered a room. Elias rested a hand on the back of her chair. Dobbs noticed that too. I'm not saying today, the sheriff continued. I'm saying the town's awake to it now. You keep her here, people will talk more. Some will question your judgment, some your motives. Others will tell you it isn't your responsibility. They'll all have opinions. He paused. What matters is whether you're willing to take responsibility anyway. The truth of that went through Elias like a fence nail driven straight. Yesterday this had been an interruption. Today it had become a line in the dirt. Leela glanced up at him. There was no plea in her face, no request, only the same empty patience, as though she expected adults to decide the shape of her life over her head and be done with it. He found that he hated that look. Dobbs set his hat back on. I'm giving you time because I know you, Elias, more than some in town would, but I can't leave this hanging forever. Either she's under your protection for now, or I take her to the church by sundown. The words landed like iron. Leela's fingers tightened on the chair rung. Elias looked at the sheriff, then at the child, then toward the window where the sun had climbed bright over land he had once believed belonged only to cattle, fences, and memory. Protection, the word should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt frighteningly close to inevitable. I need the day, he said. Dobbs gave one slow nod. You have until sundown. He crossed to the door, paused, and spoke without turning. For what it's worth, I'd keep Harlan away from this if you can. He asked too many questions for a man pretending casual interest. Then he left. The yard fell quiet again, but not the kind Elias was used to. This quiet held warning. He shut the door and stood with his back to it a long moment. Leela stayed where she was, watching him now with something almost like uncertainty, not fear, waiting. He crossed the room, crouched so his eyes were level with hers, and found that whatever he intended to say had to pass through a throat suddenly tighter than it had any right to be. "No one's taking you anywhere before I know what's what," he said. She studied him, serious as a much older child. "Okay," she whispered. That simple trust nearly undid him. The rest of the morning moved in uneasy pieces. He put her on the porch with a cup of water while he mended the hitch rail close enough to see the road. She sat cross-legged in the shade, saying nothing, watching the chickens scratch dust as if it were a grand performance laid on for her alone. Once he glanced over and found her tracing the grain of the porch board with one finger, careful not to wander far. A child trying not to take up too much room. He hated that too. Near noon another wagon came. Mrs. Pritchard this time, carrying a basket and the expression of a woman delivering virtue door to door. "I brought broth," she announced when he met her on the porch, "and biscuits, thought the child might need proper food." "She's been fed." Mrs. Pritchard peered around him anyway. "Well, all the same. A little girl needs a woman's touch. She needs peace." The woman drew herself up, offended on behalf of all respectable society. People are concerned. People are curious. She lowered her voice. "That Wade Harlan has been asking after her." "I know." Her eyes sharpened with a different sort of fear now. "Then don't be foolish, Elias. If someone truly left her, and if Harlan thinks there's money or leverage in the matter," she pressed her lips thin, "you ought to let the church take her. A woman can hide a child easier than a man alone." A bitter laugh nearly escaped him, as if good intentions and lace curtains had ever been enough to keep wolves from a door. Before he could answer, hoofbeats came fast from the road. He turned. A woman rode up on a tired bay mare, dress travel-stained, bonnet strings loose, one gloved hand tight on the reins. She looked past him before the horse had fully stopped, scanning the porch, the windows, the yard with quick, hungry attention. "There she is," the woman said. "Not there you are, not thank God. There she is." Every part of Elias went still. Leela had risen from the porch boards and moved without sound until she stood behind his leg. The woman dismounted with practiced haste and climbed the steps, mid-30s perhaps, with a face not worn by grief but sharpened by effort. Her eyes landed on Leela and held too hard. "I've been looking all over," she said. "That child belongs with me." Mrs. Pritchard clasped a hand to her chest. "Well, there now, then it's settled." "No," Elias said. The woman blinked at him, as if men were not supposed to interrupt a claim made confidently. "I beg your pardon." "Who are you?" She recovered quickly. "Marian Holt, her mother's cousin." Leela pressed closer behind him, small fingers finding the back of his shirt. He felt them like a brand. "Her mother's name?" he asked. The woman's answer came a shade too fast. "Rose." Leela made no sound, no recognition touched her face. Elias looked down slightly. "You know that name?" She shook her head once against his side. Mrs. Pritchard frowned. "Children forget things when frightened." "3-year-olds remember who they run to," Elias said. Marian Holt stiffened. "Of course she's afraid. She's been in strange hands." Still no question about whether the child had eaten, slept, been hurt, only possession. "Where'd you lose her?" Elias asked. The woman drew in a careful breath. "Her mother was ill, fever. We were trying to get her to family north of here, but the wagon axle broke. In the confusion, the child wandered. By the time we found the road again, she was gone." It almost fit, almost, but not enough. He remembered the South Road. No broken wagon, no scattered goods, no desperate searches, no fresh wheel ruts torn deep by an axle giving out, only old tracks and heat and a child left standing exactly where someone had told her to stay. "And you just now reached town?" he asked. "We were searching the other way first." "For nearly a full day." Her chin lifted. "Are you calling me a liar?" Leela's grip tightened in his shirt. Elias looked at the woman properly then, and there it was, the thing that had bothered him from the first instant. Not love, not panic, calculation. Her eyes kept measuring the child the way cattle buyers measured stock, not kin returned from loss. You got anything to prove what you're saying? He asked. The woman's mouth thinned. I shouldn't need papers to claim my own blood. You do with me. Mrs. Pritchard shifted anxiously. Elias, perhaps the sheriff. The sheriff can be sent for, he said, eyes still on Marian Holt. Till then the girl stays here. The woman took one step forward. Leela vanished fully behind him. Not a cry, not a protest, just that blind instinct at last. Hide behind the man between you and danger. Something changed in Elias then. Quietly, completely, he stepped forward enough to block the porch with his full frame. Marian Holt stopped. I'm taking her now, she said, and the mask slipped just enough to bear impatience underneath. No, he answered, one word, flat as hammered iron. She knows me. Then say something only she'd know. The woman hesitated, too long. What's the name she calls her mother? He asked. No answer. What did she eat yesterday morning? Silence. What toy does she sleep with? What song puts her down? What scars on her knee? Which arm does she reach with first? The woman's face hardened. This is absurd. Mrs. Pritchard had gone pale. She looked between them now with dawning doubt. Marian tried again, softer this time, aiming sweetness toward the place she thought weakness lived. Leela, come here now. The child did not move. Elias did not either. Marian's eyes flashed, and for one unguarded second all pretense dropped away. What looked out from her then was not family come searching. It was annoyance thwarted. A scheme interrupted. He saw it. Mrs. Pritchard saw it too. That was enough. You leave this porch, Elias said, voice low with a danger he rarely showed unless a horse was spooked or a fight half-started, or I drag you off it. The woman stared at him, then at the child hidden behind his shoulder, then toward the road, measuring chances. You'll regret making trouble, she said. I'll regret less than whoever left her on that road. The words hung sharp in the noon heat. For a beat, the only sound was wind moving through the cottonwoods beyond the yard. Then Marian Holt backed down the steps, every motion rigid with anger she dared not spend here. She mounted too quickly, nearly pulling the mare off balance, and wheeled toward town without another word. Mrs. Pritchard stood speechless. Elias remained where he was until the rider disappeared in dust. Only then did he feel the little hand still twisted in his shirt. He looked down. Leela looked up at him with wide, solemn eyes, not empty now, searching. As if, for the first time in all the hours he had known her, she was wondering whether staying behind him meant something more than chance. He lowered his hand and touched the top of her head gently. You don't go with anyone, he said, each word deliberate, binding him more than her, unless I say so. And when she nodded, leaning the smallest bit into his side, as if the meaning of safety had finally taken a shape she could recognize, Elias knew the day had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer about a night, or a meal, or a decent man doing what was proper until someone else took over. Someone had left her. Someone else had come to claim her with a lie. And for the first time since grief had turned his heart into something hard and guarded, and mostly useless for tenderness, Elias stood between a child and the world without hesitation. Not uncertain, not reluctant, protective. By the time Elias rode into town that afternoon, the dust had already done half the talking for him. Men on porches straightened, women paused near the mercantile steps. A pair of boys stopped rolling a hoop in the street and stared openly at the little girl seated in front of him, her small back pressed to his chest, one fist still wrapped in a fold of his shirt, like she feared a gust of wind might separate them if she let go. He did not loosen her hand. Marian Holt's horse stood tied outside the sheriff's office, reins thrown high and impatient. Sheriff Dobbs was on the boardwalk, speaking low with Reverend Bell when Elias pulled up. Both men looked at him, then at the child, then at the hand clutching his shirt. Dobbs exhaled through his nose. So it's come to this, he said. Elias swung down first, then lifted Leela with the same care he would have used for something fragile and not yet his, though some part of him already knew that wasn't true anymore. The moment her feet touched the boardwalk, she moved behind his leg, not crying, not trembling, just holding on. Marian stepped out of the sheriff's office before anyone could speak. There she is, she said again, sharper now, as though repetition might make the lie more convincing. Sheriff, this has gone far enough. That man refuses to return my cousin's child. Dobbs held up one broad hand. You'll get your turn. Marian's mouth tightened, but she obeyed. Town curiosity gathered in a loose half-circle. Mrs. Pritchard hovered near the mercantile, visibly regretting every certainty she had offered that morning. Wade Harlan leaned against a post outside the saloon, hat low, expression lazy in the way only dangerous men managed when they wanted folks to underestimate how closely they were listening. Dobbs looked at Elias. Tell it plain. So Elias did. The road, the child alone, the words her mother had left her with, the woman arriving too late with a story that fit only where it stayed blurry. He spoke without embellishment, just facts laid hard and straight. Then Dobbs turned to Marian. And you say her mother is your cousin, name's Rose? Yes. Full name. Marian hesitated a fraction. Rose Talbot. Elias felt Leila's fingers tighten again. Dobbs noticed. Child, he said gently, crouching some distance off, did your mama call herself Rose? Leila looked at the sheriff's face, then sideways at Elias, checking whether it was safe to answer. He nodded once. No, she whispered. A murmur moved through the onlookers. Marian recovered quickly. Children that age don't know proper names. No, Elias said, voice low, but they know voices. Marian snapped her gaze to him. You've had her one day. One day's enough to know when a child don't know you. Reverend Bell stepped forward, hands clasped before him. Perhaps we ought to slow this down. If there's confusion, let the child rest at the parsonage until matters are settled. There it was, the reasonable path, the proper paths. The one men offered when they wanted peace more than truth. Leila's hand tightened harder. Elias felt it as clearly as if she had spoken. Dobbs rose. Bell's not wrong. Till we verify things, the church may be safest. No, Elias said. The word carried farther than he intended. Heads turned. Even Harlan lifted his chin. Dobbs frowned. Elias. No one takes her from me on a half-made claim and a maybe. The sheriff's face stayed patient, but something more deliberate entered his eyes. This ain't about taking sides. This is about procedure. Elias took a step forward, enough that Leila had to shift with him to remain tucked behind his leg. Procedure left room for someone to abandon her on a road. Procedure leaves room for that woman to ride in and say she's kin without proof. Procedure can wait. Marian laughed once, brittle and offended. Listen to yourself. Since when do you decide law in this town? Since law's moving too slow for a child someone already tried to lose. That landed. Silence stretched over the boardwalk, thin and hot. Dobbs removed his hat and rubbed a thumb along the brim. If you mean to keep her under your roof while I sort this, say it plain. Elias could feel every eye on him, not just curious now, measuring, judging, some waiting for him to step back into the narrow shape they understood, a hard rancher, useful in a storm, quiet at church, bound to his fences and not much else. A man who could be relied upon not to complicate other people's notions of order. Leila pressed closer. That small weight against him decided it before the words did. She stays with me, he said, till there's proof enough to drag God himself into agreement. Marian gave an outraged breath. You can't mean to claim her. Not your concern. It is if you're stealing blood kin. You got blood kin, prove it. Dobbs stepped between them before the heat could sharpen into something uglier. Enough. He turned to Marian. You got papers, letters, someone in town can vouch for this Rose Talbot. Marian's pause was too long. Not with me, she said. Then where? At home. Where is that? North Fork. Harlan's voice drifted in from the post where he stood. North Fork's a full day and change. Funny she rode down here so quick once the story spread. All eyes shifted to him. He pushed off the post with a shrug, enjoying himself now. Marian shot him a venomous look. I have family in town." "Who?" Dobbs asked. Again the pause, again too long. Reverend Bell's expression dimmed. Mrs. Pritchard looked openly uncomfortable. The crowd felt it, that small but fatal slip when a lie stops sounding like truth and starts sounding like effort. Dobbs straightened. "Until I know more, you do not approach the child without my say." Marian flushed. "Sheriff, that is not a request." For a moment Elias thought she might break right there, not confess. Women like that rarely did, but crack enough to show what lay beneath. Instead she set her jaw and said, "Then search, ask who you like, I have nothing to hide." Harlan gave a faint smile at that, one without humor. Elias noticed. So did Dobbs. The sheriff turned slowly toward him. "You know something, Wade. Only that folks with nothing to hide don't usually ride into a man's yard alone and angry instead of bringing witnesses." Marian swung toward him. "Mind your own business." He tipped his hat. "Never was my strong suit." Dobbs's eyes narrowed. "Come inside, all of you." "No," Elias said. The sheriff looked at him, tired now. "You plan on arguing every sensible suggestion I make today. If you plan on taking her out of my sight." Dobbs studied him a long moment, then nodded toward Bell. "Fine, Reverend, take the child for 5 minutes while the adults talk." Leela made no sound, but Elias felt her body draw tight behind him. He looked down. Her face had gone stiller than ever, eyes fixed on the dusty boards as though preparing herself to be moved by force if need be. And there, in that instant, the line inside him became permanent. He set one hand on the crown of her head. "No," he said again, quieter but harder. "She stays with me." Dobbs stared, then some old understanding passed across his face. He had known Elias before the hardening, before the grave by the cottonwood, before the house went quiet and stayed that way. Perhaps that was why he did not push again. "All right," he said, "then she stays in sight." Inside the sheriff's office, the air was close and smelled of paper, dust, and the black coffee Dobbs brewed strong enough to wake the dead. Elias stood near the back wall with Leela tucked against his side. Marian took the chair opposite the desk with brittle dignity. Harlan remained by the door, hat in hand, too interested for a disinterested man. Bell stood off to one side, troubled. Dobbs began with simple questions, dates, routes, names. Marian answered most of them clean enough, but not the way truth answers. Truth tends to arrive before the mouth thinks. Hers seemed to stop first and dress itself before stepping out. Then Dobbs asked, "When exactly did the child go missing?" Marian said, "Yesterday morning." Harlan's brow lifted. "Thought you said the wagon axle broke near dusk." Marian went still. The sheriff's pen stopped moving. No one spoke for a beat. Then Dobbs asked mildly, "Did you?" Marian's eyes flashed. "I misspoke. Did you?" Silence. She shifted in the chair. "The day before yesterday." Dobbs leaned back, chair creaking. "That's a mighty important thing to misspeak." Bell's shoulders lowered a little, sorrow replacing doubt. Mrs. Pritchard, who had trailed in after all, made a small noise in her throat like shame trying to escape without drawing notice. Elias said nothing. He was watching Leela. The child had gone quiet enough to disappear into herself, but when Marian's voice rose, Leela pressed closer, cheek against the rough fabric of his shirt. Not once had she looked toward that woman as if hoping to be claimed. A child might be confused, might be shy, might forget details, but the body knew. The body knew where safety lived and where it did not. Dobbs set down the pen. "Wade, since you're here and plainly enjoying yourself, tell me why you were so interested." Harlan rocked on his heels. "Because I heard Marian ask in town whether anyone had found a girl too little to speak much and too alone to be missed quick. That struck me as odd phrasing for kinfolk." Marian turned on him. "You listen at doors now. When it serves." Dobbs's gaze sharpened. "Where did you hear this?" "At the livery, before noons." "Before," Dobbs repeated, meaning before she rode out to Elias' ranch. Harlan gave a little nod. The sheriff looked back to Marian. You knew enough to ask after a child fitting her description before you ever laid eyes on her here. Marian's composure frayed, because I had been told she was small and fair and left on the road. By whom? No answer. Dobbs asked again, this time her jaw clenched. A man in town. Name? Still no answer. Harlan's smile vanished altogether now. Wouldn't be Silas Boone, would it? That name changed the room. Bell looked up sharply. Dobbs swore under his breath. Elias knew the name. Everyone did. Boone was the sort of drifter who never stayed attached to one town long enough for decent people to learn his habits, and not because he disliked travel. Men like Boone traded in whatever would sell quickest and stain them least in their own eyes. Horses if they were honest enough. Liquor when law was thin. Information, labor, other people's trouble when neither of the first two paid. Marian went pale, then angry at having gone pale. Dobbs stood. You're going to tell me exactly what Boone has to do with this. She said nothing. The sheriff came around the desk, not threatening, just inevitable. Because if I have to go find him first, I'll do it in a temper. Marian's eyes darted once toward the door, once toward Harlan, who only watched. Then toward Elias and the child hidden half behind him. Whatever she saw there made something give way. I never meant for harm, she snapped. You hear me? I was told the woman had run out on the child already twice before. Boone said if she did it again, someone decent might take the girl and save everyone the burden. Bell made a sound like he had been struck. Elias felt all warmth leave his body. Dobbs's voice dropped. Start over. Marian swallowed. The mother had debts. Boone knew it, said there were families west who'd pay to take in a child young enough. Nothing formal, nothing written. She rushed now, words tumbling ugly and fast. He said if the woman left the girl where she'd be found, no one would ask too hard. Better than starving together. Better than both ending in the gutter. I only came because he said a rancher had found her, and if I claimed kin maybe, I could settle matters quieter. Settle, Elias repeated, each syllable sharpened to a blade. Marian flinched, but kept going. I was going to bring her somewhere suitable. Sell her, Harlan said flatly. Marian rounded on him. I said suitable. Bell's face had gone grey. Merciful God. Dobbs's mouth hardened, and the mother. Marian looked away. Gone. Dead. I don't know. You don't know, the sheriff repeated, disbelief turning to disgust one word at a time. Leela stirred against Elia's side at the change in voices. He rested his palm between her shoulders, steady, though his own body felt built of wire drawn too tight. A child left to be found, or bought, or taken, reduced to a burden to be transferred like feed sacks or second-hand tack. He thought of her on the road, not crying because someone had already taught her tears did not alter outcomes. He thought of her standing by his front door at dawn, ready to leave, because one warm night had not convinced her she was allowed to stay. He thought of the bruise near her temple. Something old and grief-scarred in him rose up not as pain this time, but as fury. Dobbs moved first. You'll stay put, he told Marian. I'm sending deputies after Boone. If he's not across county lines already, I'll have him by sundown. Marian began, Sheriff, please. No. Bell turned away and pressed a hand over his mouth. Outside, the murmur of the waiting town thickened as wordless suspense met summer heat. News had a way of pushing through cracks. So did shame. Dobbs opened the office door and stepped onto the boardwalk. Folks, he called, voice carrying the weight of office and age, there's been a false claim made on this child. Until further notice, no one approaches her without my leave. The crowd stirred like grass under sudden wind. Questions came at once. Whose girl is she then? Was she stolen? Is it true Boone's involved? Dobbs did not answer all of them. He didn't need to. The worst part had already reached their faces. Elias came out after him with Leela in his arms now, no longer caring whether it looked too familiar, too protective, too much like claiming. She had tucked her face into his shoulder and gone still. The town saw that too. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes filled, perhaps with guilt, perhaps only with the discomfort of having been wrong in public. Bell came down the steps slower than the rest, carrying disappointment the way decent men did quietly and all over. Then Dobbs turned to Elias where everyone could hear. I need your answer plain. Temporary shelter is one thing, this is another. Until the law sorts the rest, do I place her under church care or yours? There it was, not in private now. Not abstract, the question on paper and in flesh. Leela did not look up, but her hand found the front of his shirt again and held. A month ago, yesterday even, he might have stepped aside for the proper thing, might have let order take the shape other people preferred and told himself he was wise for it. Loss had taught him the danger of attaching himself to small, breathing hopes. Love made promises men could not keep. Better to run fences, better to eat alone. Better to leave one plate untouched than set it and feel it matter. But the truth had burned through too much already. Paper would not teach this child trust. Procedure would not sit beside her through nightmares. A church bed, however decent, would still feel to her like another place where adults passed her onward while speaking kindly around the edges of abandonment. What was right on paper had already failed her. He looked at Bell. The Reverend gave the faintest nod, not of pressure, but of permission. He looked at Dobbs. The sheriff's face held no judgment now, only the gravity of witness. He looked out at the town, at their curiosity cooling into something more honest, some ashamed, some defensive, some still searching for a way to make this less ugly than it was. Then he looked down at the child. She stays with me, he said, not loud, not dramatic, just final. Dobbs held his gaze another moment, then nodded once. So entered. Marion Holt made a last attempt from the doorway. You can't simply decide that. Elias turned his head enough for his answer to reach her without effort. Watch me. That ended it. The months that followed did not transform the ranch all at once. Healing rarely honored the tidy speed of stories told by men who preferred endings to labor. It came in fragments, in habits altered by need, in silences that changed their meaning. At first Leela moved through the house like someone crossing borrowed ground. She ate only what was given, slept light, and rose each morning as though expecting instructions to leave. Elias would find her near the door at dawn some days, not with her shawl on, not trying to run, just ready, in case readiness spared her shame. Each time, he would say the same thing in one form or another. Breakfast first. Shoes before the porch. You're not going anywhere. He did not know if repetition healed children. He only knew it steadied horses and grieving men, so he tried it on both of them. He bought her boots from the general store after Bell's wife took one look at her bare feet and declared the matter intolerable. Leela carried those boots to bed the first night and slept with them beside her pillow. When he found them there the next morning, he stood a long time in the doorway before stepping back out without a word. The second plate at the table ceased being an artifact and became a fact. At first, he set it down awkwardly, half expecting the house itself to object. But Leela began climbing into the chair as if it had been waiting for her all along, and soon the sound of her spoon against tin in the mornings became as ordinary as wind through the cottonwoods. Not easy, never easy, just ordinary. That was different, that was enough. The wooden horse came down from the shelf one rainy afternoon when work kept them inside. He handed it to her with a rough sort of carelessness, as though it meant nothing. She took it in both hands and traced the worn carved mane with one finger. Then, very solemnly, she set it beside her bowl instead of the floor, as if honoring it before playing. He had to step outside after that, into the rain, under the porch eave, where no one could ask a man why his eyes had gone hot. The closed room at the end of the hall stayed closed longer than it should have. Some wounds do not yield to innocence simply because innocence deserves better. But one evening he found Leela standing before that door, not touching the knob, just looking. "What's in there?" she asked. He almost lied. Instead he said, "A room belonged to someone once." She considered that, then nodded as though she understood rooms could belong to ghosts and memory both. She did not ask again. A week later he opened it himself. Dust floated in the slant of late light. A small bed, a quilt folded at the foot, books, a cracked porcelain lamp on the dresser. The air of years held shut and grief packed quiet into corners. Leela stood beside him, one hand in his. "This can be yours," he said, voice rough from disuse. She looked up at him with startled care. "Mine." if you want it." She stepped inside like one enters church, did not run to the bed, did not squeal, only touched the quilt lightly, then turned and put her arms around his leg. That was all, but he stood there with one hand braced against the doorframe because the force of so small a trust nearly knocked the breath from him. Winter came slow and blew over the ranch that year. By then she laughed sometimes, not often, not freely, but enough to change the shape of rooms. At first the sound would catch him off guard, and he would find himself pausing in the barn or at the pump just to make sure he had heard right. Later he learned which things drew it from her: the barn cat batting string, a foal nosing his coat pocket, the way he pretended not to know she hid biscuits for the dog under the table. Small footprints began appearing beside his in the yard after snow, one steady path trailing wherever his larger boots had gone. Belle noticed first when he came by with Christmas oranges and a Bible story Leela endured politely before drifting toward Elia's knee. "She follows you like a second shadow now," the Reverend said later on the porch. Elias looked out over the pale pasture. "I noticed." Belle smiled gently. "Not all gifts arrive wrapped how we expect." Elias said nothing to that. Some truths improved by being left in the air between men who understood them. By spring she no longer stood by the door at dawn. She still woke early, but now he would find her curled in the kitchen chair with the wooden horse and a blanket around her shoulders, waiting for coffee to smell the house awake. She had begun talking more too, though never wastefully. A question here, an observation there, the names of calves, the color of weather. Once, very serious, she informed him a cloud looked like a biscuit with a broken side. He told her most biscuits he knew looked worse. She laughed so hard milk came out her nose. He had not laughed that way himself in years, but it happened before he could stop it, sudden and rough and real enough to leave him blinking after. The grave by the cottonwood remained. Some losses do not get replaced. They get carried differently. One Sunday evening he found Leela placing wildflowers near the stone without being told. She looked up when he approached. "For her?" she asked, nodding toward the marker. He did not ask how she knew the grave belonged to a woman. Children often sensed the shape of sorrow before adults gave it language. "Yes," he said. Leela nodded and arranged the stems straighter. Then she slipped her hand into his and stood there with him while the light lowered across the pasture. No sermon, no explanation. Just staying. That more than anything was how the house began to breathe again. Not by forgetting, never that, but by making room where memory and new life could stand in the same doorway without one driving out the other. Late that summer, when cicadas had begun their evening song and the sky burned gold beyond the fields, Elias sat on the porch steps mending a bridle strap while Leela played with the wooden horse near his boots. She had grown into herself a little by then, still small, still solemn at times, but no longer hollow-eyed. Safety had weight now. It showed in the softness around her mouth, in the way she wandered a few yards from him and came back without fear, in how she slept hard enough that storms no longer woke her crying. The wind shifted warm through the grass. Leela stopped moving the toy and looked up at him. Elias. He set down the leather. She only used his name when something mattered. "What is it?" She studied the fading light beyond the yard as if the answer might be standing there. Then she asked, very softly, should I still wait for her? The world went still. No sound from the barn, no creak from the porch. Even the cicadas seemed farther off. He knew at once who she meant, not because Leela had spoken of her mother often, she almost never did, but because some questions live in a child long after they lose the words for asking them. He put the strap aside and turned fully toward her. For years, he had feared certain promises because life had taught him what breaking them cost. But this was not the kind of promise built on weather and luck and human weakness. This was a truth shaped by action, by months of mornings and meals and presence. A truth he had already been living long before he spoke it. He reached for her, and she came without hesitation, climbing into the space between his knees the way children do when they belong somewhere and know it. He knelt so they were eye level. The evening light caught in her hair. Her face was open, serious, brave enough to ask and small enough to still hope the answer might not hurt. "No," he said. One word, clear, certain. "You don't have to wait for someone who left." Her eyes searched his, not frightened now, only needing the rest. He laid both hands gently on her little shoulders. "You stay here," he said, "with me, as long as there's breath in me to keep you." Something in her face trembled then, not toward tears, but toward release. A tightness easing. A question finally set down. "Okay," she whispered. Then she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Elias held her there on the porch while the last light settled over the ranch, over the barn and the fences and the cottonwood by the grave, over the house that had once been all silence and now carried the soft sounds of a child's breathing and a man no longer afraid to answer when love called him back to life. Because this time, staying had not cost him who he was. It had given it back. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next firelit night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.